How's it going? And welcome to the Roll for Stats podcast, episode 1. Today you'll be joined by co-host me, No Fun Allowed, and my other co-host, Stan.
Hey guys, it's very nice to be here.
I would certainly hope it's nice to be here as well. So here we are, the Roll for Stats. Podcast. Here we're going to be talking all things role-playing, life, and whatever the frick else comes up. And of course, we'll be rolling for our character on the side. Today, the rolling mechanism will be 3d6 down the line. No rerolls, no repeating. Are you ready to see what we are working with here today?
Oh yeah, no, it's 3d6 down the line is a terrifying prospect.
You can have a terribly mundane character or a terribly mundane character. That's pretty much all it ever comes down to.
Would you like me just to begin my 3d6 rolls?
Let's see it.
Let's
see what we're working with because I'm excited.
This character could potentially be very bad or very good. But whenever it's down the line, you're playing with a whole other degree of constraint. So let's see. My strength's coming in at
14.
That's not bad.
14 strength, not bad. 15 dex.
15 dex. This character is actually looking like it might come out pretty good today, guys.
And you jinxed it. Let's take a look at that.
No, please don't. Please.
Let's take a look at that. This
is con. This is unironically a stat that in most campaigns is completely overlooked because you have control over it. And here it could be really bad. 12. Okay,
not bad.
Not too bad. Not too bad.
Not bad.
Not great, but not bad.
The physical lineup's already looking really solid here.
Yeah, no, this is already not bad at all.
But let's take a look at those mental stats, because that will truly define who our character really is.
Yeah, let's see. Wisdom is going to be 7?
7 wisdom. You haven't spent too much time outside.
I'm not I am not a wise man.
17 intelligence. Oh, you know what? You spent all time in day reading books. That's why you didn't spend any time outside.
That's insane. Okay, all right. The charisma. Here comes charisma.
And let's take a look. How charismatic are you? 6.
Not charismatic at all. There's a reason I stayed inside and studied books.
There's a reason I stayed inside.
Ugly. I'm so ugly.
Oh man.
So overall, not a terrible character.
No, not at all.
Not at all. There's certainly like very good melee stats. The 17 and int is a very nice surprise. I honestly don't know what I'm gonna make with this.
You're actually not limited. Like, of course, you can't do anything really major in regards of you're not going to be a sorcerer, or warlock, or a paladin. But I mean, other than that, I think every other class is sky's the limit.
Oh, you know what, Trevor? We did down the line run. The int is actually going to be 7.
Oh, that is correct.
The wisdom is 17. So
correct.
This is looking like maybe a pretty badass cleric. Let's be honest here. This is probably going to be a cleric here. So,
all right. As we are reveling over this character, whatever this amalgamation is going to become, this unintelligent, uncharismatic, but strangely stout individual, let's go ahead and talk about some fun things like, you and me, we are both DMs. We have been DMing for quite a while, and of course we've played in many campaigns. So what would you say is the best way to start DMing? What is the best way to finally just go ahead and take the plunge and evolve from a player to a DM?
So I think probably one of the best ways to do it is to kind of play in a few games. And I realize that philosophy very much is the chicken and the egg kind of philosophy, where it's like, okay, well, in order to play in games, I got to find people who will DM for me, but none of my friends have DM, so no one has experience. And sometimes you just have to be the first one that says, you know what, guys, I'll sit down, I'll DM. I would say if you haven't had a lot of experience playing or DMing, definitely good resources are, you know, to go out and watch how some people play D&D. You know, maybe pick up some tips online about how to start DMing. Now, like, so far as specifics, I would probably say run short campaigns.
Oh yes.
Don't set yourself up in your first campaign to run a 50 session plus adventure. Run something that is going to be 1 to 2 sessions. It doesn't need to be intricate. It doesn't need to be the greatest thing, because what you're going to find out is it's less about the content you're running and more about how you handle your character's interactions within that content.
Yeah, for
So I
sure. We definitely,
go ahead.
of course, you're talking about how consuming other media and stuff, and unfortunately, there is this funny thing going on with almost every single D&D podcast where they're sadly trying to emulate Critical Role. And if you go ahead
Yes,
and
the
sit
critical role
down and
effect.
the Critical Role effect, you know, much like the Mercer effect, the Critical Role effect is all these podcasts and all these other people are trying to get those 100+ session campaigns, super duper elaborate backstories and details. And what it really comes down to is, one, over the course of all those hundreds of sessions you have, you're going to forget a lot of things in there. And second, most important of all, is the fact that people are going to think that's the norm. And I think the norm should be the opposite. I think the norm should be you should have a shorter campaign that is action packed and a lot more intricate with the details, and every single session has at least something worthwhile to remember.
Well, and I think people may underestimate how much playtime is in 10 sessions or 20 sessions, and they may say, well, that doesn't sound like a lot. But if you're running 3 hour sessions, which is I think a fair time, some people certainly like to go for longer, but typically if you're playing for 2 to 3 hours, you hopefully are getting at least some objectives done in each session, or at least getting closer to doing them.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah, 3 hours being the average-ish time. 10 sessions, 10 times 30, or 10 times 3 is 30. 30
30, yeah.
hours of content. That's a lot. Imagine watching 30 hours of your favorite season of whatever show you, right? That is a lot of content.
Well, and I think a large part of that is how the content is divided up too. Are you going to be someone who values role play a little higher than you value frequent combat encounters? Are you going to have combat encounters that are longer? I think that really plays more into what kind of group you're DMing for. But I definitely think probably number two in the list of if you're trying to get into DMing is to manage your expectations for both yourself and your players. I think that's very important, and it sometimes takes a little while before you know what your expectations for yourself should be. But just kind of be clear as to say, like, look, guys, I'll tell you now, this is going to be a campaign that's got a lot of combat, or it's going to be a campaign where there may be less combat. But I definitely think players understanding what they're getting into and the DM understanding what they're presenting is very important in growth as a DM.
Absolutely. Like, of course, people sometimes think that D&D is just this one thing, but D&D means so many different things to so many different people. And that is why session 0 is such a big deal. Sitting down with the people that you're going to be potentially playing with for anywhere between 30 to however many hundreds of hours it's going to be. You need to sit down and say, all right, well, I want this out of the campaign, but what do you want out of the campaign? I'm going to tell you what the campaign's going to be about. Does that sound good to you, or do you not even want that? Do you want something else? And that is something that some people neglect, but I'm going to tell you right now, that is something that practically every single group needs to do.
Oh yeah, I mean, because I mean, some people get upset when they realize that it may not be something that they're interested in continuing on with, or they may drop out of the group or the D&D group and say, "Look, this was going on longer than I thought it would be." So and it's to be fair to your players too. They have to make, obviously everybody's making time in that week to sit together and play, and that is one of the biggest hurdles in D&D is scheduling and
Absolutely, it
making
is.
sure you can get five to however many people that are all collecting together to to actually be able to play, and it's a bigger hurdle than I think people realize, because being very consistent with it can be a problem. Sometimes people's jobs change, their living situations change, um, and yeah, so
Yeah,
definitely managing expectations is extremely important, I would say.
yeah, absolutely. And I think those expectations definitely, like, you come into this, game, this hobby, and you think that you'll always consistently play on that day for exactly that much time, and you'll always get this much plot progressed. But sadly, what's going to end up happening is someone's going to miss a session. Sometimes you're going to have a session where nothing really happens. You're going to have these expectations shattered. And I think the sooner you realize the fact that the game isn't going to be perfect, even though this is a hobby and we go out of our way to do it, the sooner you're going to realize that's just the way it is. This is a social game, and you're interacting with so many other people. If it's only 4 other people, that's still 5 human beings who live completely separate lives. And having them all somehow show up to the exact same place, exact same time, with the world not interacting with them. Even in today's day and age, even with everyone sitting inside their homes all day, still life gets in the way, unfortunately. But
Well, yeah.
learning to temper, what is going on in the real world with the game is probably the best thing to do, both mentally and just physically, I guess. You're gonna have to sit down and forgive yourself and forgive everyone for life getting in the way.
Well, and I think that's another point to lead into is don't be so hard on yourself if you're learning to DM. If you're new, and let your players know. Say, look, I'm new at this. I don't know how good this is really going to be. Um, but if you have a good group of friends, then hopefully they'll give you a chance. And if you're all really into it and are kind of seeking to do more stuff with D&D, I think it's a great opportunity to get involved. So,
And the first
definitely,
time you DM, you are going to suck.
yes. And there are some people that are better than others, but you will, if you stick with it, you will get so much better at it over time. Even if you start fairly strong, you will improve your craft. And
Absolutely.
you cannot be like, man, my players are just doing this and that, and I'm just, I feel like I'm not able to give them what they want or whatever. And if you feel like the campaign's going that direction, talk to your players and say, how can I make this more fun for you guys? I think being open as a DM is a very good thing too, and open to criticism and constructive criticism, of course. But encourage that feedback and want that feedback.
Absolutely. Ask your players what did they like about the session, and then you can expand upon that. But most important of all, you ask them what didn't they like about that session, and then you think about ways to mitigate that. And working with those two paradigms of getting rid of the stuff that they don't like and expanding upon the stuff that they do like is going to make your game better over time. You're going to have to sit down and be brutally honest with yourself, and hopefully your players will be brutally honest with you. Because if you don't have players that are brutally honest with you, then you're going to keep doing the same thing, thinking that it's great, and you're not going to know any better until one day, someone tells you otherwise, and it's going to shatter you, or they're just going to leave you and move on to something else. And that's definitely not what you want. You want a consistent group, because something magical happens over time, over months and years of playing with the same group over however many different campaigns. You get to really form a bond, and that's a great thing to get, and you should really strive to get that.
And by no means feel like you need to bend to what your group is pushing you to do.
Absolutely.
Sometimes, and there is a difference between saying this is the way the campaign is going to be run, or this is the way that things need to be done, versus seeing what you can do from the feedback or do with the feedback to improve the game. One common issue that I hear a lot of DMs talk about that they very quickly learn from is that they hand out too many magical items. And that, I think, is maybe a little bit more of an issue with them wanting to give their players good things and the players are having fun. But I would definitely say temper that with less is more. And maybe when they come across some of these items, it feels more earned, or it's something that they had to work a little harder for, because then they will really cherish it more. And in that way, you kind of keep player power in check. And player power is another issue in fifth edition that I think Trevor and I both agree on is that it can get out of hand pretty quickly.
Oh yes.
And if you've given by level 5 your party already has +2 items, or certain items that they certainly shouldn't have at that level, or just an abundance of them, they can sometimes break the campaign in ways that the DM doesn't foresee. And it becomes, then you're like, okay, well, what do I do here, right? So I definitely would say, like, new DMs, less is more, because your players are going to appreciate the uniqueness of the items regardless. And sometimes you can give them things that are upgrades or an improvement of something that isn't necessarily a magical item either. There are ways to reward your players, outside of gear and gold. But yeah, I would definitely say, kind of keep the campaign shorter, because typically that's not too much of an issue in a short campaign. And if it does become an issue, it won't be an issue for terribly long. And it's kind of, you can lead into maybe it's like, okay, my players are stronger than I thought they were going to be. I'll kind of maybe, before the final encounter, I'll maybe tweak my encounter a little bit, or I will, kind of do something different, right? And you can kind of adjust for it. But I definitely say those are probably my tips for new DMs. Obviously, DMing and D&D means different things to different people, like you said earlier. And I think knowing that, the DM has to kind of be open to playing different play styles. And I think you have to find a group that fits you, and the group conversely needs a DM that kind of fits their play style a little bit too.
For sure. So we talked a little bit about like the pacing of rewards and all that. So you got to think to yourself, right? If you plan on running a 50 session campaign, then you should probably have at certain intervals, whether that be 5 or 10 sessions or whatever, that the party gets something good. And with 5th edition in particular, because the magic items only scale to 1, 2, or 3, you have to think to yourself, if it's going to be a 50 session campaign and you give your players a +1 item at 10 sessions in, then are you going to keep that same pace? Because I promise you, at some point, you're going to outpace yourself, and you're going to have to sit there and think to yourself, oh, they already have like +2 weapons, but we're only 25 sessions in. How much further can they get? How much more can they go? And you have to seriously consider all these things, which once again, it goes back into the less is more, petering these things out over time, and most important of all, giving your players not just items, but resources, whether that be friends or contacts, whatever the case may be, these non-intrinsic things. Give them something that a lot of times you can just go ahead and give the players something that isn't necessarily better, but you can also give them something that's like, oh, one is good in this regard, but it has a drawback, but this other thing is the inverse. And then you can have that dynamic of which one do your players choose. There's a lot of that to go around. There's a lot of, oh, you can give your players this mundane item, whether it be like a potion that makes you grow, or you can give your players a potion that gives you fire breath. And then they have to sit there and be like, this one could be useful here, but that one could be useful there. Just always things to consider. Don't always just try and one-up yourself. Just go ahead and keep the pace running smooth. And speaking of running smooth here, let's go ahead and take a dive at this. What do you think this character is going to become here?
I'm definitely thinking cleric. With the 17 with these stats, cleric makes a lot of sense. I would like to maybe get something that boosts. I mean, obviously this 17 is going to go to an 18. I'm going to have to pick a race that gives me that bonus, and that's actually kind of what I'm looking at now. I've decided, this is going to be a cleric character. and I just have to figure out what race I'm gonna be now. So I'm thinking, I'm not gonna lie, I am thinking maybe half orc.
Half
I
orc
need
is
to see
pretty
what I
dope.
can. I mean, melee clerics are no joke, and if you know how to build them right, you can make an extremely powerful character. Unfortunately, Centaur has given me strength and wisdom bonus, but I'm not I'm not
not
into that. Thank you very much.
not running the Holy Centaur, huh? And
Well,
speaking of clerics, though, they got a pretty big buff in regards of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything.
they got some new subclasses. In fact,
New subclasses, and they each universally get a solid D8 worth of damage whenever they make a melee attack at level 8.
oh, was that not? That was already that's already a thing,
It's
isn't it?
partially in. So how it is now every single cleric can potentially get that at 8th level, but the classes that already get it can get something else.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, because I've seen some clerics don't get it. They instead get some other features.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of clerics get the blessed strikes.
Yeah, well, yeah. So
Which
it's either you get additional the D8, or you can get your Wisdom modifier tied to any damage you do with cantrips, stuff like
see,
that.
that's actually extremely good.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, the
Sacred
cantrip
Flame now is
versatility.
actually hitting pretty hard.
Well, yeah, especially considering it's a save spell. Like most of the time, at least with cantrips, you know, you're not going to have that additional bonus, and that just adds a flat bonus. Because if you roll low on a cantrip, it's not a lot of damage, but this ends lower that lower buffer that it's like, yeah, even if you do roll really bad, it's a lot more reliable than it was. Looks like they also got Aura Vitality, which is extremely good for clerics.
Oh yes, yes. Basically, with Tasha's, a lot of people are getting more spell access, which for bards in particular, they get access to certain spells, which, quite frankly, probably should have already had because they are thematic, but they didn't get probably because of maybe balance. But obviously, bard and balance don't exactly go hand in hand. But
A
that's a
bard's the
that's a
most
topic for
broken
another time.
class.
But Tasha's definitely going to be changing a lot of people's perspective on running games, because you have to sit down and think to yourself, or say, hey, am I going to allow this at my table? Because obviously the whole thing about your race being able to, the stats being able to change, that was done with the intention of, yeah, you can be anybody and do anything. And that intention is good. But the problem is not necessarily that's the problem. The problem is that there's problem players, and they're gonna go ahead and make min-maxy characters, and that only makes it even more min-maxy for sure.
Well, I think I think there's the min maxers, but the min maxers always min max with what they can do, right? Like you're going to have a character who will choose to be a wood elf because he's trying to min max, and I think what it does is it adds less of a focus on it. I think it's a little out of the theme of D&D though, because every edition up until now, your race has had some impact on your ability scores, some of the things you get, and it just added, I think, a great diversity into the world. If you are a half orc, you got dark vision. You're physically bigger and stronger. If you're a halfling, you're a little quicker. You have a smaller stature. You can't move quite as far, but that's okay because you knew what you were getting into, and you had a choice in the matter. But this is a little bit, I think with what Tasha adds, it does lead into a potential to have maybe some broken builds that are maybe haven't been tested well enough within certain circles to see how broken some of these things are. I've heard that the Rune Knight is actually extremely powerful. I haven't gone over it myself yet, um, but I heard they have some pretty gnarly stuff.
Well, much like all the UA stuff, it was OP because Wizards' philosophy with all of their Unearthed Arcana is make overpowered stuff and then nerf it later. So the Rune Knight, of course, was one of the many things that got nerfed because in the UA it was way better, and all the other ones same as before. Definitely, it's funny because in a lot of games, whether they be like card games or just games that last a long time, typically what ends up happening is as expansions go on, there's a certain power creep to the game, where eventually the new stuff is just quite frankly better than the old stuff. And it's funny to think that at some point, 5th edition is gonna be in that same regard because if we take a look at the player's handbook classes, such as the Beast Hunter
Oh
Ranger,
no.
and compare that to a new Ranger, you're obviously going to be like, one is not like the other here.
Well, one is just objectively bad. And I'm honestly with new content, I really am of the mind that it's better to start low and then buff it to where it should be than it is starting high and then nerfing it, because it just from like a player standpoint, it doesn't feel good to be nerfed, but it does feel good to be buffed.
Yep.
And if your class goes from, I mean, imagine if your DM allows you a UA class, and it ends up being extremely strong, and then it gets nerfed in a book that comes out later. Then it's like, okay, well, do you stay with the version that is considered to be overpowered by Wizards themselves, or does your DM make you shift into this other, this new release of your subclass? And I think it kind of makes it a little bit awkward at the table to handle some of those things. But conversely, if you're playing a class that may be not optimal, which you can certainly do in D&D, don't think you can't. Like a lot of people feel like they have to play an optimal character, and that is not the truth.
Absolutely.
You can play whatever you want. But when you play an inoptimal build and then it gets buffed a little bit, it's like, okay, now now you have maybe some more options. But
yeah,
I think that it's there's some cool stuff, but I think Tasha's stuff is either a little underwhelming or very, very strong.
It's a weird balancing act of making all these new classes because once again they're also trying to, with all these new expansions, they're always trying to create a new design space, and they're always introducing all these new abilities and they're trying to be creative with it. A perfect example of that is at one point during the UA they had a fighter subclass called the Brute, and that one was universally regarded as lame because it was really powerful, but all it did was just give you additional dice on everything you did. You would roll additional deck roll, you would roll additional damage dice, and it was just boring but effective. They definitely don't want to do that. They want every single mechanic that comes with all these new subclasses to be unique and stand out from the rest. But there's only so much you can do. We're already over 100 subclasses in 5th edition, which is pretty nuts, to be honest with you. There's a lot of options out there. So hopefully between all those 100 plus subclasses, you can find something that fits well for you and isn't overpowered or underpowered. Alrighty, so we've been talking a lot about how to start our games and what to expect from our games, but what about when we go down the line once we're experienced enough? What about writing our own campaigns? Of course, the modules that we've been getting so far are excellent. In my opinion, every single 5th edition module is worth running to some degree. However, some of them require a lot more working than others. But what happens when you want to go off the rails and just say, screw it, I'm going to make my own campaign and it's going to be great? Where do you start off with that?
I would say the starting point to that is asking yourself, what kind of campaign do you want to make? Because you can have campaigns that are hex crawlers, you can have campaigns that are more cerebral and are like more heavily role played oriented. You can have some campaigns that might be, PvP oriented, as crazy as that sounds. But you need to determine what you are going to build, because if you sit there and you have this idea for a cool storyline, but you don't give it the right canvas to build off of, or the right foundation to build this campaign off of, it's not going to come out the way you want.
Yeah, I've definitely taken a crack many a time at writing campaigns, and whether that be just world generating and just trying to throw a story in there to some degree, or actually sitting down and writing its own campaign. No matter which one you're doing, the world building one in particular, like that is its own set of work, but it is just massive. You are gonna have to sit down, and I would really sit down and compare the modules in a sense to your campaign, because you have to sit down and say, all right, what is the early level content? Where are they going to be going? How many people are they going to be interacting with? What will they be given for a quest? What kind of dungeons are they going to be going into? What's the theme of the monsters that they'll be fighting? There is a lot to dive into there, and I'm sure there's some prodigies that can sit down and make a campaign in a night. But I promise you that if you want to make a campaign that's on par with what Wizards of the Coast is cooking up, you're going to have to be spending days, more likely weeks, prepping for making this campaign.
And you definitely have to work up to that point too. Don't expect your first module or don't compare it to Wizard of the Coast modules in terms of the quality of how good it is. Kind of definitely know what you can do, and kind of learn from these campaigns, right? We kind of talked earlier about starting as a DM and you want to run short stuff. Well, this is kind of more, I think, in the context of if you're running something that's a little bit bigger or a little more complete in what it is. I would say, I certainly like, for my campaigns that I write, I really like to have them in the Forgotten Realms. I'll usually have them on location somewhere in Faerun, and kind of do a little bit of research into what those regions are like and what they can kind of expect, and kind of build the campaign up from that, and kind of reference some source material for stuff I'm building. I know a lot of people will want to sometimes build their own setting, and I implore you, I applaud you if you do that. But I think there is, like you said, there is an inherent long process in world building, and it takes time.
Holy.
And sometimes you will be working on something for months, maybe even years. Sometimes it takes some time for you to work out certain processes in your mind on how storylines are going to continue. And I'll say this, sometimes you build it as you need to. Sometimes you'll have, areas of the module that might not be 100% done. But if they become an area that you need to finish, or a plotline you need to finish, certainly give yourself enough room until the players get there for you to kind of flesh out your ideas and to use the area in a way that's useful. You certainly don't want to have, you don't want to have like dead space in your campaign. Like, no. You don't want to have just periods of time that, like, there's no motivation for the characters to go and do stuff. They're kind of stuck and they're in a rut. And I think maintaining that momentum is very important.
Absolutely. There's definitely a lot of that. You think to yourself, okay, I've got this beginning, I've got an idea of what the middle is, and I've got an idea what the end is. But in reality, a lot of times there's a lot of in between there, and you have to keep them moving, because you could at the very beginning of the campaign say, all right, there's this big bad evil guy, go. And that could be, of course, the driving crux to getting your players to go wherever it is. But I know for a fact that a lot of time you need more direct things. You need more interactions with the party right in their face. you need things that are constantly pushing the players out of whatever comfort zone they have and get them going out into the world and exploring and meeting all the people that you introduce. And you hit it on when you were talking about before, but cutting out the world building, in my opinion, is one of the best ways to start building campaigns. Taking out any sort of, okay, I've got to set up this own world and its own pantheon and its own kingdoms. Not having to worry about any of that just by placing it in either Forgotten Realms or any location that has its own world written into it. Do that. Just go, because one, if you go online, you can easily find any information about any world that you are going to build a campaign around, and that really helps drive the campaign. Whether your players already know all of the information that they'll find in the land or not, that doesn't matter, because what really matters is the fact that you will spend less time world building and a lot more time building the adventure that they want to play in, and more importantly, the adventure that you want to run.
Well, and I think you just said it too. Sometimes your players will be really familiar with the setting, and that can be a double-edged sword. I think most of the time, if you do your research, you can be ahead of your players in like the lore and what there is in the setting, and sometimes you can make it up a little bit as you go. You don't necessarily need to be so hard and by the book on the source material that you become inflexible in the way you craft your setting. But you can certainly use it as reference material. If your characters are like visiting a famous city, right? Like Waterdeep or Neverwinter or any of the cities that are in the Sword Coast, you want to look up some information and stuff like that, but more likely than not, just have some outline of when they get there. Obviously, you're going to want to know, like, and it depends on how important that setting is going to be in your campaign and how prevalent it's going to be, versus how much information are you going to need to know off the fly. And sometimes you can say, oh, let me check my notes. If they're asking about a specific detail and you're not sure, that's perfectly fine.
And definitely, I think a great way to cheat world building is by taking places and just renaming them, and maybe warping some idea about it. Instead of your game taking place in the Sword Coast, it takes place on the, as Matt Mercer has done, the Menagerie Coast. Like, that's a perfect example of what he's done right there. You can just go ahead and change the name of some locations, slap on a different feel. Instead of Baldur's Gate being a more roguish-like place with a whole bunch of political factions that are moving up and down, maybe it's more of a elven-themed location, and it's a little bit closer in the woods. And you can have the place be, instead of Baldur's Gate, it's Woodland Gate. Who knows? Like, really simple world building tricks there that you can implement that, depending on how far you go into it, your players aren't going to pick up on, but for you, it's going to make your life infinitely easier.
Yeah, not everything has to be purely original. You can certainly take and borrow aspects of other things, and like you said, retool them to what you need. And I think if you do that, it'll be a lot easier to get that momentum for yourself, because you can certainly, and I have this happen to me, as you're building a campaign, kind of hit, a point where you're like, all right, what's next? What do I need to build next? Because sometimes you can over prepare, and you can get stuff, so built out and say, okay, we're going to have this main quest, and they're going to have to do this, and this. You can get yourself to where you're building so much, you sometimes run the risk of making something that might feel too on the rails. But kind of be very amorphous in where your players want to go. Do not be afraid to make up parts of it as you go. If they ask about a part of, maybe the city, they're like, oh, what's the guy's name who like runs the sewer municipality? We want to go down to the sewers. And you're like, oh, I didn't think about making sewers. That's okay. Just kind of wing it. Kind of temper it with the knowledge that most of what you say is going to be, canonically what's there. You definitely do not want to retcon And
Never retcon, never.
never, just, yeah, I would say like that does seem a little harsh, but I have to agree, never retcon, because once you start retconning, the persistency of the setting feels, it all of a sudden doesn't feel safe, and you just like, oh well, if that gets retconned, something else might get retconned, right? And it leads to too many implications of, okay, well, because this is retconned, does that mean X, Y, or Z, right? So just never retcon, be kind of thoughtful in some of your responses. I've definitely had moments where my players have asked me the name of an NPC, and my brain goes white hot in panic.
I That only
Um,
happens to me every single time any NPC ever gets brought up ever.
it's just like, oh, what's your name? And I'm like, well, I have a mini panic attack, because you're just like, oh, you want to know his name?
I'll tell you what,
Uh,
that happened to me exactly one too many times, and since then, now whenever I'm
it's
DMing a
unavoidable.
campaign, I'll have a little cheat sheet on my DM screen, whatever it is, usually online, and it'll just be a bunch of random names, and I can quickly pick up on that.
Write them down though. If you do that, write them down and make sure
Yes.
you have a catalog where you specifically denote it's like, this is this guy, because it's easy to forget, when your party goes back to a place they haven't been to in 15 or 20 sessions, and they're like, hey, let's go talk to that one guy, and you're like, that was a really obscure character. He wasn't really, it might be, something that they remember very vividly, and you're like, oh yeah, what did he do? And it's, I would say that's also very important when making your own campaign, is kind of have a backlog of emergency names, um, because you're not going to have a name for every single NPC in the town, at least not concretely before you run the campaign. And some people may have the time to be that thorough with it, but I
There's
think
no
most
need to.
people, well, I think most people, when you're writing your campaigns, or at least beginning to write campaigns, um, there's no need to, you know. Be sure not to bite off more than you can chew. I think that's also a very good advice. Um, Kind of make sure that what you're doing, is not going to be something that's such a lofty goal in mind, um, that it's something that you'll reasonably, maybe not be able to finish. But again, like, sometimes your campaigns can be on a much smaller scale, and they may not be an entire world that you're trying to create. Maybe you're trying to create just a specific city, in which that your campaign takes place, and then you have a whole different list of expectations, of things that your players can probably try and explore.
And I think that can really lead to an amazing, eventually, overall group dynamic of your first campaign, this maybe 10 to 20 session little adventure, takes place in one city. And then the next adventure you have takes place in the same world, but is down to the next city. And basically, over the course of time, as you're playing with these players and playing as all these new characters in these new areas, you eventually get to draw this own map of this world that you are creating alongside your players. And depending on the nature of all these adventures that you're having, they could be interlocked together where, one person does something and now there's a war between another city. And then in the next campaign, the war's still going on, but all of a sudden your players, set the forest on fire, and then the next city over has to deal with the ramifications of a burnt forest. There is a lot of great stuff you can do with interlocking these things, and eventually it does lead to that world building that you probably sought. But it wasn't in one sitting, of course. It was over the course of time, and more importantly, your players inadvertently helped you with that world building.
Well, yeah, and again, you're not having to build everything. You're not having to build the entire world, but through advancing, session, different campaign to campaign, through different parts of the world, You could have it with the same characters if you wanted. You could have it with new characters. You could have it maybe with maybe you have a mini campaign that is maybe you're playing like the role of a villain or like the villain's underlings, and you kind of get a fleshed out view of maybe both worlds, you know. So that would be a very very good way to build your world and be able to have your players come to the table while you're still fleshing that world out. Because a lot of the time, the feedback you get from the players' interactions is very, very useful. Because you may find out that they think a certain part of the campaign is really cool and interesting, and that'll help lead you into what you want to learn or what you want to build next as they go.
Absolutely. And speaking of building as we go, let's take a little update on our character here. What are we cooking up?
I'm cooking up a mountain dwarf cleric. So he's going to have 16 strength, 15 dex, 14 con, 7 int, 17 wisdom, and 6 charisma. I feel like you can't go wrong with cleric. For his subclass, I hate to do it because every time I make a cleric, I go Tempest, but it's such a powerful
Tempest is you can't go wrong. You can't go wrong.
Oh, it's so strong. It's so strong. Although they did get the new Twilight one.
There's the Twilight one coming out in Tasha's.
I've not looked at this yet, actually.
You should take a look at it because it lets you see in the dark, and you can go ahead and help all your homies out, and they can see in the dark too.
People undersell how powerful dark vision is, or at least when you have dark vision, you take it for granted because you're just like, yeah, I can see. What's the big deal? But when you're like a human and you're stumbling around in the dark while your elf friends are laughing at you, you feel so useless. You all of a sudden realize you're like, man, being blind sucks. And that's essentially what you are. You're blind. And sometimes your DM will be really, really, graceful and give you maybe a little 5 feet of vision as you're moving about, so you can at least see what you're next to. But yeah, it's extremely important. Do dwarves have dark vision? I think they do.
Dwarves do. They do.
Yeah, they do. So let me look at the Twilight Cleric. They get Fairy Fire and Sleep as a first level spell. Moonbeam and See Invisibility.
Very thematic.
Vitality. Yeah, very thematic. Fairy Fire is actually very nice as well.
Oh, yeah.
Sleep is pretty good. It's kind of an interesting cleric build. It's kind of on the border of sleep, I guess, or kind of nighttime. I mean, it's Twilight. It's in the name.
Yeah, so that's another one of the classes that took a big hit because, as per written in the UA, it's basically said you can see. Oh, you have dark vision as far as you can see. Meaning that what that implies is that you could stand on a mountaintop and you'd be able to see everything perfectly fine.
Yeah, I mean, you just see, yeah, it's kind of crazy.
So it being pushed all the way back to a mere 300 feet is still, 300 feet is still pretty freaking huge, but at least it's not, you can see for miles.
Okay. So I know. So I think that I'm gonna definitely make some kind of melee cleric. Look, I hate to do it. I think I'm gonna go Tempest.
It's just
the wisdom's very high. The wisdom is going to go up, and I guess the dex may go up as well. I mean, I could do at level 4 I could go 18 wisdom and 16 dexterity.
That wouldn't be bad.
I don't know why I'd go so high dex, but it would be nice.
Initiative helps. Dex saves help.
Initiative help. Dex saves help. If needed, I could wear not super heavy armor. And
you could come across a
dex bonus.
Yeah, you could come across a pretty good medium armor that's magical. That could be so.
Yeah, I think I'll do that. This character is actually for a down the line character. This came out very, very strong.
Oh yes.
I was worried I was going to have some very very docile creature that was going to come out of this build.
I know for a fact at some point down the line we are going to get someone that rolls incredibly bad, and it's going to be great. I can't wait
It's
till
going
we
to
get that
be,
person that gets all 8s and 10s across the board.
yeah, that's going to be murder. I mean, we had Dopey in that one campaign you ran.
Yeah,
Who
we had a dopey.
who
So
had,
the
was level.
TLDR, which I know for a fact I'm going to make a video about this character at some point because it's just such a great story. But basically, his highest stat was a 10. And needless to say, he didn't make it too far in the world.
No, no, he didn't.
He didn't. Rip Dopey.
But sometimes, when you have a character that rolls stats like that, uh, you can look. It is a meme, and a lot of the time the players are not going to want a character that has a negative to everything they roll. But that doesn't mean you can't make a character that can not still be useful. There's a lot of options that you can take. Specifically, Circle the Moon Druid is not reliant on stats very much at all.
Oh, yeah, you don't need any stats to be a Circle of the Moon Druid.
No, you don't. Well, with 5 HP, it's still very harsh. You may not take that. You take that spillover damage pretty badly.
Very true.
But there's not only you can still do stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, a perfect example of that being I've rolled up bad characters before, and I either went on to play clerics or bards that all they did was either buff or heal everybody. And more often than not, buffing people, such as giving everyone bless in your party, you don't need stats for that. You just give everyone a D4 to all their attacks, and that's awesome. And for healing, yeah, of course there is some rolling involved, but healing's healing. You don't have to sit there and cry and pout if you get a bad character, because you are the one that decides it's a bad character, not the dice. The dice just make some characters just a little bit better.
You say that, Trevor, but then you have a character that can't seem to roll above a 5.
Well, in regards of the bad dice
it's enough
rolls,
to. It may not make the character, Trevor, but it can certainly unmake the character.
Oh, some bad dice rolls will always unmake characters for sure.
Yeah, no, it can be very rough. But sometimes that's the campaign you play in. I personally, all my campaigns I build, I do point buy, because rolling for stats can be very polarizing, and it can feel sometimes kind of rough when you roll a character whose highest stat is maybe 12, and there's another character who's Chad McGee, and his lowest stat is a 12.
For sure. Yeah. Once again, that harkens all the way back to that session 0 thing of what do your players want out of the campaign? Because if your players want this to be a pulpy style action adventure game, then do point buy, because point buy will make everyone on even footing. And, depending on where they go from there is up to them. But with rolling, you definitely have to consider the ramifications of you will have people that roll bad and you will have people that roll good. And that just, that's invariable with the dice rolls. No matter what type of system you have for dice rolls, it's going to be not even. And if you do somehow find a way to make it even, then it probably would have just been better to do point buy in the first place.
Exactly. So while we're still on the topic of writing campaigns, you want to talk about villains?
Villains are the thing that make any campaign, really. You can, of course, have a theme of, going up against some type of antagonist, or maybe some entity, not necessarily humanoid or whatever, but just a society of ideas, and that's the villain of your campaign. But more often than not, it's much easier for you to simply create a single person or a cabal of people that are the villain of the campaign. And I promise you that a great villain will go down in your players' memories forever and all the time. And that requires a lot of work. You can't just have villains that never interact with the party at all whatsoever. You can't do what old school D&D did, where there'd be this bad guy in the final room and he'd say one line and then they'd fight and then whoever wins wins. You need to have your villains present in the campaign. And they themselves don't have to be the ones physically there. They can be the ones pulling the strings. And at every single point throughout the entirety of the campaign, your players are getting thwarted or getting assaulted by agents of the villain. And eventually, once your players interact with the villain in a more meaningful manner, then it will truly, come to light of all the things that they've done and finally get that satisfying conclusion of dealing with them.
Oh yeah, I think it's a lot better to kind of leave breadcrumbs and trickle in events that tie your character's decisions into your overarching villain. It's sometimes fine to let them go the first 6 levels without really interacting with the villain or your main villain in a meaningful way. You can certainly have smaller villains that end up becoming, nuisances for the party that may not be your big bad guy, and that's okay. Like your big bad guy, he sometimes isn't going to be the best written villain in your campaign, depending on how your campaign plays out. He may be the villain your campaign's centered around, but sometimes you'll have villains that just very naturally form kind of a nemesis with the party.
Absolutely.
And that's okay. It's just like, sometimes it's fun like that, and it's more personal. You can sometimes have more personal villain interactions with a smaller tier villain, and maybe not smaller tier, but somebody who isn't, the main villain of your campaign. They can certainly become very, very fun to role play and to interact with the party. And maybe there's like a situation where your party is like track them down, and it's like, oh, they're gonna fight, and then your villain gives them the slip and they show up later, and it creates a lot of fun dynamics. Sometimes it might not even be a situation where the villain is someone who's trying to kill the party. Maybe the villain is somebody who is opposing the party in a lot less of a physically threatening way. Maybe it's a council member in a city who is kind of blocking the party politically, and in ways that the party may not be able to directly kind of challenge their power. You can have very interesting interactions with people like that.
I think one of my favoriteest villains I've ran wasn't a villain at all. He was just a simple, common human, and he was just a neighbor of the parties, and he did everything in his power to basically one up the party. And I think that was a really great dynamic of having an antagonist that wasn't there to kill the party. He wasn't there to ruin their entire lives or whatever. He was simply there to be a better, service.
Better businessman. He's just trying to be. Yeah. He was our competing business, and that was the way he put himself into an adversarial position against the party, which I think is good. Adversarial situations with your villains don't always need to be violent or combat oriented.
In fact, I think there's a lot more dynamics to it when there isn't combat, specifically for more of those roleplay settings, such as in cities or towns or whatever, where that you wouldn't be able to kill this person because that's illegal. Or if you do kill them, then something terrible would happen to you. And playing up those villains that are just out of reach of being able to be killed by the party is great, because your players, I know for a fact, are going to be creative in how to get back at them. Instead of them going and just trying to stab the person, they'll think to themselves, okay, how do we ruin this person's reputation? How do we destroy their business? How do we go about setting up a smear campaign? Whatever the case may be, it's a lot more interactive with the world and between your players if they cannot kill an individual.
Well, yeah, and you know, it's like, are you really going to kill that guy because he's competing with you? And unfortunately, there are probably a surprisingly large percentage of players who would say, "Yeah, I'd kill him." And you know, yeah, that's kind of more into who you invite into your table, and sometimes you know that's fine, but certainly I think it poses more of a challenge where the players need to kind of maneuver and finesse around what this other character is doing or the way that he is opposing them, and it makes them be a little more creative. It makes them think about things more. It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to undercut him? Are we going to try and put him out of business in some way? And it becomes a lot more fun, and more importantly, it's less dire. And sometimes you need those light moments in D&D
Absolutely.
to kind of decompress, because if it's combat every session and it's, you know, life or death all the time, those dangerous moments are going to lose their luster, and it's going to be, you know, your characters have a lot more going for them. They're like, yeah, we built this business or whatever they're doing from the ground up, and there was a lot of interactive role play that, you know, wasn't boring, but certainly wasn't combat oriented. And I think that goes into kind of letting your players do what they want to do. You know, sometimes your players will want to hang around town for a week or two and work some jobs and kind of build relationships there, and that's perfectly fine. Um, and it kind of goes round into what we talked about earlier in the podcast about getting stuck. You certainly don't want your players to not feel like they have enough leads in that situation to continue on where they are. But sometimes you don't need to have time be so ever present. And they can kind of get to it when they need to. You know, sometimes you will want to say, look, you know, you don't want to wait too long. But sometimes you're like, yeah, you know, the players, you guys need to go meet this guy, right? And it's not for any pressing reason. And they're like, okay, well, we're in town. Maybe, you know, before we head out, we'll do these things, right? And that's perfectly fine to give those things to your players and let them do those things as downtime activities.
Absolutely. The tempo of at which your game takes place is definitely a big deal, because no matter what campaign you're running, whether it be a city adventure or a world hopping adventure, there is going to be a lot of in between time of, okay, if you're in town and your players need to go from one side of town to the other, are you going to sit there and role play out every single bit of it, or are you just going to go ahead and say, okay, you arrive here? If your players are going from town to town, then are they expected to be jumped all the time? The tempo at which the game is going is a really big factor, because it not only impacts in-game time, which is, you know, more impactful if there is a timer or not, but more so it impacts real-world time. If you decide to throw encounters out in the middle of your players traveling, then yeah, they can go ahead and get into an encounter. But if that encounter isn't worthwhile, was it worth having at all? Because in 5th edition, if you're running a really solid combat, it may last 30 minutes or an hour. And is that combat actually progressing the plot along? Is it actually doing anything? Are your players learning anything from it? Or are you just throwing an encounter because you felt like they needed combat? There's a lot of things you need to consider about the time management, both in game and out of game. Like those combats will eat up over time. If you have, like we keep on talking about, the 10 session campaign, then how many combats are going to be in that campaign? I promise you, if you run 10 combats in that span of the 10 sessions, that's nearly a quarter of the time of your entire campaign is combat. That's a lot of time, but that can be an absolutely great time, or it could feel like some of those combats were just completely unnecessary.
Yeah, I definitely think overloading combat can be a bad thing. And I think it's, you know, when you really look at the three tenets or the three pillars of D&D, it's combat, roleplay, and exploration. And if 50% of the time it's all combat, that only leads 25% for each other subject. And again, that really boils down to what type of campaign you are running. If you are running a campaign that is supposed to be more combat heavy, that's perfectly fine. But I think if you're writing a campaign and you want a good balance, I think you really need to balance those three things. And if you're having, if you're basically having a single dungeon that's not supposed to be like a mega dungeon, just it's just supposed to be a normal dungeon, and they're in there and it's almost all combat, that can become a little bit tedious. So be very careful, I would say, how much combat that is going to be that you're going to run across. And I think you were exactly right when you said, is if it's meaningless, why have it? You definitely want your combat to be meaningful, and not specifically deadly, but you need to have the combat mean something as to what's happening in the campaign. Are they getting the combat because it is just a random encounter, or is it something that is going to progress them some way in the story and kind of build upon the other two pillars?
Absolutely. Those three pillars are, they're it's such a balancing act of how much they interact with the party and, more importantly, how much the players want out of it. You can, of course, have those groups where they sit down and they say, yeah, we actually don't really care about the role play. We just want to show up and beat up monsters and go to cool dungeons. In the case, easy peasy, you can go ahead and draft up some awesome dungeons with some awesome traps and exploration and some cool combat encounters. Don't even care about the role play. But you're more than likely, of course, going to get players nowadays where they want a bit of that role play and they want exploration. And I think nowadays we're definitely seeing a lot more people that are not necessarily a boring combat, but typically trying to ignore it. Which is funny because, back in the day, there was no roleplay. The dungeon was created before the town in D&D. But nowadays,
Yeah.
people crave that social interaction. And it means that there is more work for you because, quite frankly, those roleplay encounters do require a bit more preparation on your part and more, it's completely improv most of the time about what's going on. So it does require more work on our part as the DM, but if that's what the players want, then they're going to get what they want.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that goes for a lot of things. Um, if you build certain encounters and then you expect your players not to take long rest, you need to have a good reason why they can't. Um, whether it be, because you don't want to just say, oh, you guys just can't rest here. The answer is no. And it's like, okay, well, why? You know, we have our bedrolls. We could just sleep here. And in that case, you could very much imply it's like, yeah, there's, like you guys, like there are still monsters in the dungeon. They may come across you, but you guys can set up watch. But if your players really want a long rest, they're gonna find a way to get a long rest in most situations. So you have to kind of identify, you know, what you're giving your players, how you're giving it to them, and if you're denying your players certain things, under what circumstances. Because most players, if they're not able to have something, if you give them sufficient reason, they're okay with it. It's like, okay, I don't have my items anymore because we got robbed and we all gave up. They were like, put your weapons down. There's 30 of us, and the party like is like, okay, fine, we surrender. And that was their choice. And under those circumstances, it's a little easier to do that. Now, sometimes the players will kind of resent it if they don't have an opportunity to get their stuff back. But there are certainly circumstances that happen where they might not. They may not be able to recover their things, and
And
they
that
kind of have to understand that that's a circumstance of their choice.
absolutely, and that's definitely something where you have to sit down and you have to make sure that your players understand that you are crafting the best story possible. And if you're doing things and they don't pick up that you're trying to make this story amazing, you have to consider as well, is the story that you're presenting great for them, or is it only great for you? You want to craft an amazing campaign, but at the end of the day, your ideas, your ideals and visions might be different from what they wanted. They might have wanted to play awesome adventures that can show up and go anywhere, do anything, and beat up whoever they come across. But you might be trying to present a campaign where, okay, there's certainly these people that they cannot mess with ever, and if they go there, they're going to get their butts kicked. You have to you have to present that at the table, right? You have to say, hey, these are some bad people, don't mess with them. And hopefully your players don't see that as a challenge of, oh, they're strong, we can take them. You really need to sit down and build that rapport with your players and say, okay, when I say this, it really means this. Like, it's not like I'm meaning something else. But once again, that is, of course, something you will build up over time with your players.
Well, and I think it's if you DM for the same group enough times, you get a better understanding of what their expectations are, right? If you've DM'd for me for multiple campaigns, and I think for our whole group that we play in, I think everyone understands what to expect from you as a DM, and you know what to expect from us as players, both as a group and individually. And I think that comes into being familiar with your players. I know sometimes people are like, "Oh, I want a DM, but I just don't know anybody." Well, that puts you in a bit of a unique situation where you can invite random people together, but be very prepared for potential friction that can come up from something like that. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm saying that's where managing expectations really needs to be crystal clear. Because if people come to a campaign not really knowing how to interact with both the DM and the other players, that's something that's going to be needed to really be established before you start playing. And that's what you do, kind of in session 0. I know some people talk about, like, should session 0 be just the DM and the player, or should it be all the players together? And that's really up to how the DM wants to run it. Sometimes, I think in session 0 is where you're already familiar with the players. A one-on-one is really good. But if it's, everyone's kind of coming together for the first time, maybe that session 0 you need to have with everybody. So you can get on the same page and, have reasonable understanding of what you need to do and what your players need to do.
Absolutely. There's so much when it comes to any role-playing game that you ever play, and it's funny how at the end of the day, when you're playing a game however many sessions down the line, playing the game's easy. You have your character sheet all done up, and all you need to do is roll dice, and you go places and you do things. But the hardest barrier of entry for any role-playing game is starting it. And that is involving, of course, learning the rules, building your character sheet, understanding what is the expectations. All these things are absolutely front-loaded, and that does drive people away from the game. There's plenty of people that don't want to sit here and learn the rules. There's people that don't want to have to go out and make characters. There's people that don't like the idea of being restricted in any way, shape, or form. And you are going to have to get over that hump, over that hurdle with with as many people as you can to try and build that awesome group that you will be DMing for or just at least playing for as long as you can. And speaking of building those characters, let's go ahead and take a dive into this. What is this person? Have you finally decided upon a Tempest?
Yeah, I'm going Tempest. I just rolled for my gold, so I have 140 gold. I assume I'm rolling for gold.
Absolutely.
So I had 140 gold, which is not bad, actually. Not bad at all, considering my cap was 200, which I'd have to roll all fours for, which is unheard of. But no, 140 is a very good. It's above average. So I'm looking now at my background because that's going to determine what skills that I take. We were talking earlier about nobles, and having the retainer
Absolutely.
as one of your features, which is kind of cool. I like that very much.
And that is definitely
Or I guess it's the knight, the noble knight.
the Noble Knight, yeah. So that definitely goes into, depending on the game that you're running, when your player goes and finally makes their character sheet, consider what are those classes? What are those backgrounds? Like if you are just are you not just a barbarian, are you? Are you a barbarian that ranges from the wilds and goes out hunting every single day and lives off the land? Or are you a barbarian that was taught by some, Ronin that was roaming the lands? You grew up in a village and this person taught you how to channel your inner rage. What are those backgrounds? Are those backgrounds simply just little features that you get and a little bit of extra gold and money? Or does it really tie down what that character did before they became an adventurer? Or maybe it's still what they're doing today. You can really sit down and really flesh out a story for this character just by looking at a few little tags here of what is their class, what is their background, why is it that they have these certain stats here. Like, this guy, we can sit here and craft an amazing story about how this guy, this dwarf, is just this awesome physical specimen, but at the same time, he's incredibly intelligent, but he doesn't interact with people well. And
Oh, you mean he's incredibly wise?
he's incredibly wise. Correct. He's incredibly wise, but he's apparently doesn't crack open books, and he apparently doesn't talk to people that well. Why is that? Why did this character?
It's probably because he's a dwarf. No, it's very, very fitting. That he has a low charisma, as most dwarves do not have charisma. Fun fact: in older editions, dwarf had a minus to charisma.
They did.
All non-human races had a bonus to a stat and a minus to a stat, and that was very common. Although that's for the most part gone away in 5th edition. They did it with the kobold and the orc, which I thought was a little weird that they would not kind of stick to the 2-1 kind of scheme that they have for races. But yeah, I mean, I think that it was more of a throwback to older editions, which Wizards is still doing. I think in certain modules like Rime of the Frost Maiden, you see a lot of throwbacks to older editions in both like the creatures you interact with, in some of the things that you see. I don't want to say anything, in the spoilers, but yeah, exactly. Or I don't want to say anything specific, but it does have a lot of very neat throwbacks.
Absolutely, and they know that their old product has some gold in it. They know it because, not only are the pre-made modules all having some old school motifs, they've already introduced 2 books that are all collections of old school modules, Tales from the Yawning Portal and Ghost of Saltmarsh. Both are not new modules. These things are old. They're either anywhere between 10 to 30 years old. So they know that there's some great stuff to be picked from. And obviously now they're getting into this whole debate about the races having negative stats and whatnot, but that is definitely a topic for another day. The thing is, though, is how much do you want this game to feel like it is real? Do dwarves in your world, are they homogenized just like every other race? Or do dwarves have something very specific about them? Are dwarves natively stronger than everyone else in the entire world? Or are you going to come across dwarves that are just everyday people? That goes back into that world building we talked about before. Do these certain races interact with other civilizations in another way? Are the races intertwined with each other's in certain ways? You can make worlds that do what Wizards of the Coast does and just have them all homogenized in these major cities. And then while at the same time also having these people out in the wilderness, all these tribal people, like we're talking about Icewind Dale, there's Reagan nomads full of mostly humans. And then we look down to the south, and then there is some orc tribes. And then we go down over there, and there's some dwarves in the mountains, and et cetera, et cetera. You can sit there and you know, we were talking about this before, but not just the class and the background, but the race as well can also help tie in what this character really is and how they fit into the world.
Yeah, exactly. I think your character background is very important, especially for more of a campaign that relies on narrative and character-driven goals. You do see a lot of campaigns that will sometimes, definitely cater to what the characters are after, rather than like being a on the rails experience that brings the characters through an adventure. Sometimes things come to the characters very naturally through their setting in the world. Waterdeep, I think, is a good example of a module that gives you a lot of opportunity to set up a character that has, maybe they're from a noble family, maybe they're someone who is a minstrel in the town. Maybe there's somebody who isn't even from the city but has come here for a certain reason, and that reason can tie into your character's backstories. I think that does tie in a lot to what kind of module you're wanting to build and you're wanting to run, and what kind of module your players expect to have. But definitely, if you plan to have a module where you want to rely a little bit more on your characters' backstories and tie that in with the plot of the campaign, then kind of ask your characters, or ask your characters, ask your players to kind of sit down, maybe familiarize themselves a little bit with the setting. That certainly can be useful when you're building a character.
Yeah, and that's actually something I want to talk about too. Is don't build the campaign after the characters. And I see that a lot. There's a lot of people who sit down and they say, oh, I need to play this exact build and I need to do this, and they act like this and they only do things this certain way. A perfect example being they could be saying, oh, I need to play a UNT bard that is super happy-go-lucky, sunshine and rainbows. But if you're running a game where the people are supposed to be evil, then that's not going to mesh well. And you really need to sit down, and before anybody actually makes their characters, you need to say, hey, this is what the campaign's about. And that way you make sure that they don't go in with any, weird preconceived expectations. And more importantly as well is that they don't come in with any sort of emotional baggage that they need to have their character a certain way and the campaign needs to be tailored around them.
Yeah, and that's also another thing is as a player, definitely recognize, when the spotlight needs to be passed around. And sometimes pass it yourself. If you happen to have it, sometimes that can be a great opportunity for you to segue into someone who hasn't had a lot of time to speak during a role play interaction, and giving them an opportunity. And I think that's more about having players that understand that tempo that you mentioned earlier. It doesn't just really apply to overall arching stuff and kind of a pace to the entire campaign, but into minute to minute role play. And I think having players that can pick up on that on their own and do that on their own is very good. My favorite thing is when my players are talking amongst themselves and discussing stuff, and I haven't said anything for 15 minutes.
Oh yeah,
I think that's a very good sign that your players are doing stuff.
I definitely love when my players are either talking or, usually in my case, arguing amongst themselves, and I just get to sit back and enjoy, because as a DM, you a lot of time feel like you're the producer, but every now and then you can be an audience member, and that's a great feeling, getting to see something that you helped build. Obviously, your players are doing just as much work as you during the session, but you a lot of time think to yourself like, oh, I've done all this work. But you need to recognize how much effort your players are putting into the campaign as well. This isn't just a one-man band. This is a full-blown operation. You're just the conductor.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to allow your players to run away with things. If all of a sudden, you have this great thing planned and your players want to spend like 3 sessions trying to negotiate to buy a piece of property in the city, maybe let them do that. It gives them something to do in their downtime. Now, I would definitely recognize if something becomes a derailment. But you have to sometimes build as you're going on the rails. Unfortunately, most campaigns are in some way on the rails, and I think a good DM will make it to where you don't really see those rails, or it doesn't feel like you're on a railroad. But unfortunately, most campaigns at the core of them have to have some railroad. Um, but again, that kind of comes in with how well as a DM you temper that into what your players expect and want out of the campaign.
Absolutely. I know I talk about this a lot, and I'm gonna make a video about it at some point, and maybe this will be a topic for a whole podcast. But the three ways I see you can run a campaign are the sandbox, the railroad, and the roller coaster. The sandbox being you create a huge world and your players interact with it and do whatever the frick they want, and that can have its great rewards that your players feel like they're free and they move around this world and do whatever, and hopefully you have some stuff cooked up where no matter where they go, no matter what they do, things are happening. Two, you have the railroad where you're essentially on tracks. You definitely go somewhere and do something, but maybe they can change and hop tracks. Maybe they can go ahead and choose options A, B, or C. And those choices down the line will eventually lead to their own separate A, Bs, and Cs. And that keeps the game moving forward. What you are, of course, nudging your players along, but hopefully they are taking whatever you're putting in front of them and rolling with it. And last, and certainly not, or last and potentially least anyway, is the roller coaster where your players go somewhere and they do something. Typically, you don't see that for actual campaigns. Typically, you see that for one-shots where you say, all right, the adventure begins as you are entering the dungeon. Go. That is a roller coaster, which for one-shots works beautifully. But for campaigns, typically you wouldn't want to do that because if players have no feel of agency for a long period of time, they will feel probably not as genuine about what is going on. So I think a combination specifically between the sandbox and the railroad are the best ways to craft a adventure.
Well, and I think that's where that exploration pillar comes in as well. You know, there are different types of exploration. It doesn't necessarily need to be a hex crawl, but it could be, you know, the characters going and seeing what's down this alleyway, or they go into a forest that they've never been to before. And sometimes your players will really surprise you where they want to explore, and sometimes it may be places you're not entirely prepared to be. But in that regard, I would say don't worry about trying, you know, just theater of the mind stuff. If you're playing at the table, that's usually what you're doing anyway. And you're playing on Roll20, it's, you know, it's very easy to theater the mind something like that. Now, if it's a big enough thing, you can certainly say to your players, look, guys, we're gonna have to maybe end a little early today. I have a lot of prep to do this next week to kind of, you know, to work on this stuff that we're about to present. But that's okay too, you know.
Absolutely. Don't play something that you're not prepped for.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's no perfect right amount of prep, but it is always you do want to over prep for some stuff because you don't want that happening every other session where you're having to end early because you're not prepared. But at the same time, I did say earlier in the podcast, over prepping in world building can be sometimes it can take the wind out of your sails. Absolutely. Because you're doing a lot of stuff. You haven't had an opportunity to play test any of it, and you know, sometimes, like, you know, like we also said earlier, playing it in chunks can also help with that. But when you're talking about session to session stuff, you do want to over prep, and that way you typically won't be kind of caught unprepared.
Yeah, I talked about this with Fish in the Hex Crawl podcast, or I guess it was just an episode. But one thing to really help out if you're running a sandbox in particular where your players have a bit more free reign is, yeah, let them have that free reign, but ask them where they're going, specifically between sessions. If you just straight up ask them, hey, you know, you guys have story beats that lead you here, here, and here, where are you guys thinking of going? And they will give you their honest thoughts, and hopefully they tell you absolutely the truth and say, we are definitely going to go here next session. Then, instead of having to bother trying to prep everything, you just prep the thing that you know they're going to. And that, one, talking about the game outside of game time gets them excited to play the game. And two, you get to truly get their feedback about the locations, because you give them plots to A, B, and C, and you ask them, hey, where do you want to go? They'll say, okay, we definitely want to go to A, and you can find out why. Do they think that that's more pertinent to the adventure? Do they think that it sounds more exciting? And you can also compare that to the other ones. Why don't they want to go to C? Did I not tell them enough about the location? Or maybe they don't think it's important. I have some really cool stuff prepped for that location. Maybe I should start thinking about divulging a bit more information about that in the future to come.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely about, getting to where things organically come up in your campaign. You can still have something in your pocket that you really want to get to, and you can always tweak the encounters if you're worried your players aren't going to get to it by the time, if it's something that you want to send at them at level 6 and you're worried they may not get to it at level 8, you can always, tweak some numbers, tweak some creature HP values, maybe add in another couple of mobs to the combat. That's perfectly fine. But kind of definitely recognize when you have something good, how can you present it to your players where it feels good to go there? Because if it feels good to go there and it's a really good experience and a really good, little jaunt, if it's a side quest or if it is a shorter campaign, it's going to be memorable. And it's going to be something that after it happens, they'll talk about it for campaigns to come. I mean, we still have funny things that we talk about in some of our old campaigns we played into, specifically a lot of Tomb of Annihilation stuff that happened. But it's very fun to talk about it and to bring it back up. And I think stuff that kind of is well prepared, you'll be well prepared to present yourself. I would say kind of coming into our next topic here, as kind of we're ending or getting close to the end of the podcast, we can kind of talk about how to start your campaign as you're writing it. And that is one thing I personally think is very challenging, is what is it that's bringing all of your player characters together? What is it that they have in common? And I think sometimes you can go to your players and tell them, say, hey, look, I want your feedback. Do you guys want to play a campaign where you all already know each other? Do you want to play a campaign where maybe one or two of you guys know each other, or maybe one or two of you guys are like brothers or sisters or something like that? And, you have some tie-in, and sometimes that can be very, very helpful. You can have situations where, two or three of the characters already kind of trust each other, and then three other characters already trust each other as well, and then they just need to extend that trust out a little bit. And sometimes having a footing where your PCs trust each other already can be very good, but you also have opportunities for it to be like, okay, you may not know these other characters very well, and then you get to a point where you guys are introducing each other, you're talking about your past, your backstory, maybe little tidbits here and there of who you are. But getting your players together can sometimes be, that launching off point can sometimes be a little harder for, I think, maybe newer DMs to write and to get where they want to be.
Absolutely.
Because you can certainly say you guys all meet at an inn, but
I mean, that is the oldest line in D&D. So you all start in a tavern. That is
which
the
is
line.
Inherently not bad, but sometimes you want to do something different, especially for the campaign you've written that might not meet your requirements or your needs that you need.
Yeah, so over the course of however many modules I've ran at this point, God, how many? I'll have to make a mental list of how many I've ran so far. But definitely that's one of the things that's always the odd one of, How does your group actually come together? Do they know each other, etc., etc.? And I've found over the course of time, there's 3 pretty simple, solid solutions to that. One, they all know each other already, simple as that. And the characters already know each other, but the players don't. And basically, you can have it throughout the course of the game where they begin to explore and know more about each other. And you can have that immersive storytelling of, oh, hey, I didn't know you could do that. And that would definitely lead into a lot of, you know, we could make another whole podcast about this topic, but leveling up's this odd, weird thing in the game. But you can definitely have that thing of, oh, I didn't know you had that ability when you just leveled up. Oh, hey, you have that spell prepared. That's awesome. That's definitely something you can do. So having your group already know each other and gets rid of a lot of the headache of having to write a lot of things. 2, if you want to go down the route of writing things, having the group patron. The individual characters might not know each other, but they all know someone, and that someone brings them together. And that someone doesn't have to be a single person, mind you. That can be an entity, or they could all be friends with someone who's part of an organization, and that organization brings them together. A perfect example being many of the 5th edition modules all have that patron mentality to start the campaign, where your players just happen to know someone, and that someone says, hey, I've got someone that you would like to probably meet, so you guys can go ahead and team up and do something. That is a really great way to get people that don't know each other to work together and have a common thing going on. They might have way different personalities, they might be different classes and from different walks of life, but at least they're friends with someone, and hopefully because they're friends with someone else, they will eventually become friends. And the third one that I've seen work is just let your players do whatever the frick they want. Hopefully your players are sitting down at the table to have a good time with each other, in which case they should be autonomously working to try and make the game better. You can obviously have those problem childs that come in and try and disrupt everything, in which case don't run for them. But more often than not, if you have a group of people that want to play together, they're going to make it work. They're going to sit down with each other and say, hey, why would I hang out with you? You know, my character is nice and your character is not nice. Maybe there's something that happened in our past. Maybe we're all combined. Maybe we all went through something harrowing together. You know, maybe we are just 2 peas in a weird pod, opposites attract kind of thing. There's a lot of different ways your players can go ahead and approach that. And that harkens back all the way back to those session zeros. That is definitely something you bring up and say, hey, how do you guys know each other? I've got some ideas, but how about you guys go ahead and you come up with your own ideas? And if nothing comes up, I'll take the reins, but I want you guys to have that control. And having that control over the characters' origins and steering them into whatever campaign you're doing is a great way to get them invested in not only their own characters, but everyone else's characters.
Yeah, I think allowing your character or your players to sit down, especially if your campaign you plan to run it a little more sandboxy, I think letting them sitting down and saying, "Look, guys, how do you want to start? You know, I have like 3 or 4 different options or different ideas of ways we could start the campaign. What do you think about this? Or what do you think about this?" And maybe have them put suggestions forward. So they may not know what you're going to do, and it's still a surprise, but you get a good indication of what they want out of an initial session and what they all feel kind of socially contracted with one another, saying, yeah, we'd be okay with that. Because then there's less of like, oh yeah, my character wouldn't do this, which is, you know, a character sometimes wouldn't do certain things, right? Like you obviously wouldn't have like a lawful good paladin steal, so you wouldn't want to have necessarily a character that's a paladin in the campaign that's going to be about a bank heist, right? But that's a matter of, you know, the player understanding what kind of character they're building for the campaign. Now, I think that, you know, knowing that everyone is okay with a certain way the campaign starts certainly takes the pressure off of you and takes the guesswork out of, you know, how do I do this? How do I get them all together? and being able to take those suggestions and manage what they want with what you have planned and how you want to segue the beginning sessions into your campaign. um, I think that information is really invaluable.
For sure. There's definitely, we harked on this before, but there's definitely a lot of people that come down with different expectations, and you just got to sit there and clear the air. You got to sit there and discuss how to make this campaign amazing. And it's not just going to come down to you doing everything, because you can only do so much. You need to have the players interacting with the campaign. You need to have them interacting with each other, and you need them to be forthcoming to you as much as you are forthcoming to them. Which is odd, because as DMs, we are the ones that sit behind the table. We are the ones that are cooking and scheming up things. But at the same time, you need to be transparent with a lot of stuff. And, it sometimes it's a balancing act. In fact, all the time, it's this massive juggling act that you got to do. But you got to do it, because we sit down to play these games, and we want to have fun, and you got to put in some work to have some fun. Fun ain't free.
Well, and I think everyone needs to put in the work, not just the DM, but the players need to also recognize when they have to kind of be a little more inquisitive, or maybe kind of recognize that there is a mystery afoot and they have to kind of explore a little bit more. And as a DM, you have to also lay out options where it's like, well, if they happen to fail this check, what now? Is the trail just cold forever, or will they have opportunities through other avenues to still gain progress into what they're doing? So kind of temper your, I would say, like, skill checks and DCs with maybe a little more of a backup plan in case things fail.
Degrees
and
of
again,
failure, for sure.
degrees of failure. Not everything needs to be pass fail. Sometimes it's like, yes, even though you rolled an 8, you are able to see that there are footprints, but you're not. You see that they're going north, but you're not able to follow them reliably. Something like that. Versus if someone rolls like a 21, it's like, yeah, you're able to follow the footprints pretty much all the way where you need to. You certainly have different opportunities to kind of weave in other things, and certainly you can have other players assist someone in their roles as well. You would be surprised, especially the bigger group you have, how many times that you'll have groups where everyone's like, yeah, we all want to make perception checks here. And even if you have characters that are good at perception but happen to roll low, sometimes the people who are bad at perception roll very high. And don't be afraid to make skill checks that your character's not good at. Always take those opportunities to be involved.
Yeah, and that can definitely lead to emerging role play as well, where you have that person who's got the +8 to perception and they roll a nat 2, and then you have the person who's got a -1 to perception and they get a nat 20, and then you get to sit there and craft the story of, okay, so why can the barbarian see so well, and why is that cleric that has the observant feat? What's going on with them, right? And you can sit there and have a fun 2-minute little roleplay part, and then once again asking your players to do this as well gets them involved with the storytelling of the world. They can go ahead and just forge some elaborate story of, something was caught in my eye, the barbarian poked my ear, and it caused me to go a little loopy, something fun, right? And those moments, I promise you, those funny little moments are a lot more memorable than the dice rolls. Whenever you think back to all these fun stories that all your characters have been up to, you typically don't think of the dice rolls. You don't think of staring at the stats on your character sheet. You think about the people in the moment, and you think about the weird, kooky shenanigans that are going on all around them. And those personally are, for me, why I play D&D. I love thinking back to all these moments of all the epic things I've seen all these characters do. And once again, I don't think about it as staring at stats and numbers and character sheets. I like to put myself in the scenario. I like to put myself right next to all these epic heroes that are doing all these epic things. And more importantly, I like putting myself next to all these people when they're doing funny and stupid things, because those memories will live on for quite some time. And those will truly make whatever DM experience you have or whatever player experience you have just absolutely a dream.
I think you're very right. I think that it's at the end of the day, and we talked about this earlier. D&D means different things to different people, but at the end of the day, you are sitting down with a group of people to have fun and to have a good time. And I think that is maybe also one of the biggest things that I can also suggest to new DMs is just have a good time, and as much as you can provide a good time for your players as well, because that is what is important. If everybody's having a good time, that you've succeeded.
Oh yeah. And once again, it's going to take a while for you to figure out what a good time means. It's going to take a little bit of time. And of course, the first couple of times you DM, whether that be actually DMing or just DMing for new people, the first times are probably going to suck. And that's just the nature of it. But you're going to suck at everything you do for the very first time. First time you hop on a bike, you're going to fall. First time you DM, it's going to be a little bit awkward. But the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. And it will be rewarding. It will be so rewarding. Eventually, crafting these incredible stories with these incredible people that you meet.
Yeah. I mean, you have the experience. And that is at the end of the day what is important.
So. And speaking of experience here, how about we take a final inspection?
Take a little look
at what we have cooking here with this beautiful cleric that you've rolled up.
So I have made a cleric. I have not named him yet, which is often something that's also hard for me when I'm creating a character, is figuring out what I'm going to name him, because it's something that it's something that putting a lot of thought into, doesn't really matter at the end of the day, but it does have a degree of permanency. It's whatever everyone's going to call you. So he's going to have a name here in a minute, but I have decided to make a Tempest Cleric. He is a mountain dwarf, so he gets a +2 to his strength and con. I took Folk Hero as a background, which gives me bonuses in survival and animal handling. I also get Rustic Hospitality as a feature for Folk Hero, which I'll go ahead and read it here. Since you come from the ranks of common folk, you fit in among them with ease. You can find a place to hide, rest, or recuperate among other commoners, unless you have shown yourself to be a danger to them. They will shield you from the law or anyone else searching for you, though they will not risk their lives for you. So, very interesting build, actually. My skills are animal handling, insight, medicine, and survival. I don't have my channel divinity yet, which is a big feature for Tempest Clerics, but I'll get that next level if he survives. If we ever do anything with this character, probably we might. We might for sure. We'll do something with him. But no, he's coming along very good. He's got 18 AC. I've only had to spend about a little more than half of his gold, and he's pretty much fully equipped. He's got a warhammer, a war pick. He's got a shield. He's got scale mail. So he's a pretty good level 1 character for a roll down the line 3d6 character.
For a roll down the line,
he came out really good. Yeah, whatever we do with him, I hope he survives. Because he'll be fun to play.
Well, you just better hope I don't throw a mind flare at him with that
-2 to intelligence. He'll get oh man, my favorite part is like the fact that I'm proficient in my charisma save, and I have a +0 to charisma because I have a 6 in charisma. Man, the -2s are harsh, but they're not the worst stats. Int is one of the least rolled saves.
Very true.
And charisma is a little more common, but it's not as bad. Like wisdom's a very common save. Con and dex are extremely common, and so is strength. So this character is well, like I said, 3d6 down the line. I'll tell you what, there's a lot of characters that 3d6 not down the line are pretty bad.
Oh yeah.
But
You came
I'm
out.
excited for this.
We started this. This is the first of many to come, and you came out the park swinging, and I rue anybody who follows you up here. They are in for a terrible time.
His name's gonna be Veldug.
Veldug the very lucky.
Veldug the lucky. There we go. Maybe his first feat will be lucky.
I mean, hey, he deserve it. This guy looks like he can do great things in the future.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we talked a lot about DMing, whether this applies to more first-time DMing or stepping out from the pre-made modules, or whatever the case may be. You know, just general DM tips for DMing, because even us, you know, I've been DMing for 4 years straight, and Stan's been DMing for how many years straight at this point?
About, I would say about 3 solidly.
3 years, yeah.
I've yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and even though we've been DMing so many sessions, you know, between me and Stan, we DM how many, like 2-3 sessions on average each week, right? We DM a lot, and it doesn't matter how much you DM, you are still going to be learning something new constantly. You're still going to be refining your craft. You are going to, even years and years down the line of DMing, you're going to have a session that's bad, and you're going to think to yourself, you know, that was bad, but now that you're tempered with that wisdom, much like this cleric here, you are tempering your wisdom with the knowledge that, okay, I recognize that was a bad session, or at least I talked to my players and they told me it was bad. How do I fix this? How do I make it better? And
oh man,
that
we could do a whole episode on just like mistakes we made that we learned from.
Oh, absolutely.
In previously campaigns. Oh my goodness.
Absolutely, we could. But yeah, we talked a lot about that, and I think we gleaned a lot of information here, and I hope that we imparted a lot of that information onto you. This was certainly a blast, and I certainly can't wait to be doing more of this, because this is great.
Yeah, this is fun. Thank you for having me. And I look forward to our discussion next time.
Absolutely.
And if you made it this long in the video, thank you for watching this long into this podcast.
Well, admittedly, I don't expect too many people to watch it. I expect many people to listen to it, but
that's fair. That's fair. I mean, you know what I mean, though.
Absolutely.
Sometimes, you know, that's the way it goes. But if you were here for the whole ride, congratulations.
Yeah.
We recognize you. We see you.
I see it. So yeah, that's gonna do it for episode 1 of the Roll for Stats podcast. Thank you so much for everyone that watched. Thank you so much for my co-host Stan, and that is gonna do it for me. Thank you so very much for watching. Thank you to all my lovely patrons that are listed right here. You guys are incredible, and just keep on keeping awesome. That is gonna do it for me, though. Thank you all for watching, and I can't wait to see you all in the next one.
Adios.